In February 2022, Split the Difference launched a campaign to secure UN state party commitments to address intimate violence experienced by boys and men. The first year of this campaign focused on the need for a gender-specific strategy to address the needs of male victims of domestic and sexual violence in Northern Ireland. And as we begin to expand our focus to other UK regions, I want to share a summary of outcomes and findings to date. So over the next hour, I will cover who Split the Difference are and what we do, why we're calling for a strategy of male victims of domestic and sexual violence, why we started the campaign in Northern Ireland, a summary of our engagement to date, key areas of disadvantage and discrimination that we are concerned about, and last but not least, recommendations for action. So let's begin with who are we and why do we do what we do. Split the Difference's aim is to raise awareness and campaign within the United Nations member states for equality and gender parity for boys and men. We encourage consultation, guidance, legislation and policy that support boys and men equally to women and girls. Our ultimate goal is to help convince the UN and UN member states of the need to take proactive action to protect the human rights of boys and men, much in the same way that they currently do for women and girls through work led by the UN Women. We are based in Wales, officially established in 2019 after 6 years of research into international human rights pathways. Our initial projects are focused at a UK level, however, we have already established partnerships within numerous other UN member states, including Canada, New Zealand, America, India and the Sudan, to mention a few. We aim to act as a critical friend to UN state parties, beginning with parties within the UK. We exist to help protect the human rights of boys and men, and therefore this presentation will almost exclusively focus on their specific needs. I make no apology for that, but before we go any further, let me say 4 things about female victims and the charities and public bodies that work hard to protect their rights. Firstly, our vision is for a world where all victims of violence are provided with the protection, support and justice that they need and deserve. And when we say all victims, we very much mean all victims, across the full spectrum of protected characteristics including women, men, boys, girls, people who identify as non-binary or transgender, people with a disability, people of all ages, races, religions, sexual orientations, and in all cases members of their families who are often also affected. Secondly, we do not promote or support positions that advocate removing resources from female victims to address the existing gaps in support and services for boys and men. Thirdly, we respect the right of charities to restrict their services and support to female victims and to promote an ethos of by and for women in their approach to service delivery. And fourthly, we support the right of public authorities to fund and deliver gender-specific services and strategies when they have shown to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. I sincerely hope the constructive criticism I share with you all is received in the spirit that it is intended, and the one conclusion that I would like to share with you from the onset is that over 12 months of engaging with public bodies in Northern Ireland, I have personally witnessed a very strong and sincere desire amongst public servants to do the right thing for all victims of abuse. And to best explain why we focus exclusively on the human rights of boys and men, I now ask you to consider the human rights pathway that led us to start our campaign in Northern Ireland. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the first and arguably the most important brick in the pathway to protection for fundamental rights for all. Adopted by the United Nations in 1948, it committed member nations, including the UK, to recognise that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, entitled to basic human rights including the right to life and liberty and freedom from slavery and torture, and entitled to these rights without discrimination. Over the subsequent 70-odd years, there have been many more significant bricks and bridges added to this pathway to protection for people at international, national and regional levels. Most relevant to this discussion are the Council of Europe's Convention on Human Rights, the UK Parliament's Human Rights Act 1998, and a Northern Ireland level in the same year, the Northern Ireland Act 1998. And as you can see, if we add a traffic light system to our pathway to protection, once again and crucially, all of these significant milestones include everyone within their scope of protection. Other relevant milestones along the path that are especially relevant to domestic and sexual abuse include the UN Convention for the Elimination and Discrimination of Women, or CEDAW for short, and the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, better known as the Istanbul Convention. Both of these conventions have been ratified by the UK government, and significantly the scope of protection provided by them only applies to women. Now, on the one hand, these conventions are to a large extent signal boosting and clarifying protections that already exist for all, and the argument goes that they address types of violence and abuse that disproportionately affect women, and that boys and men in the UK aren't disadvantaged by the existence of female exclusive human rights instruments because male victims already receive adequate protection from gender-neutral instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Human Rights Act 1998. And besides, as UN Women have put it, equal rights for women does not mean fewer rights for men, because equal rights is not a pie. Now obviously, equal rights clearly are not a pie, but also clearly the state does not have an unlimited resource to invest in infrastructure intended to protect the human rights of all its citizens. And as we will see, enhanced levels of protections at international, national and regional level can have a significant influence on how those not unlimited resources are directed. For example, since 1989, the UK government have been required to regularly report to the UN on actions they have taken to protect women from violence and to provide female victims with appropriate support services. Not all victims of violence, just female ones. And since 2012, the UK government and de-evolved assemblies have also been required to regularly report to the European Commission on actions taken to protect and support female victims of violence. Again, not all victims of violence, just female ones. And this has significantly informed the Home Office's approach to tackling domestic and sexual violence in England and Wales, which for over a decade they have progressed through their strategy to tackle violence against women and girls, which, as well as encouraging terminology and data recording approaches that diminish the visibility of male victims, it also ring-fences the vast majority of public money flowing from it for service providers within what has become known as the violence against women and girls sector. And this uniquely gendered approach to progressing public policy is justified by the repeated claim that the overwhelming majority of victims of these crimes are female. So if the majority of victims of gendered violence are female, why do we need a strategy to address the needs of male victims of domestic and sexual violence? Well, to begin with, the majority of charities working with male victims are calling for such a strategy. And in the context of our perception, understanding of and reaction to domestic and sexual abuse, male victims are very much recognised as a minority group with distinctly gendered issues. Whilst a minority police service for Northern Ireland data also shows that male victims experience abuse in significant numbers. 1 in 4 child victims and 1 in 5 adult victims of sexual abuse are male, as are 1 in 3 adult victims of domestic abuse and 1 in every 3 victims of domestic homicide. There is also a clear and easily documented empathy gap for male victims of violence, and we believe that the key to addressing this cultural, social and political phenomenon is to consciously acknowledge that such a gap exists. Clinical psychologist Martin Seeger gave an excellent presentation at our conference in Parliament Buildings on how at both a conscious and unconscious level, both men and women are naturally more inclined to protect and show empathy towards women when directly compared to men. For example, at a conscious level, even human rights instruments such as the Istanbul Convention tell us that we must recognise that women are victims of domestic violence and that men may also be victims of domestic violence. One reason for this is that their experiences are rarely articulated or understood because there are so few advocates with the time, energy or remit to speak for them. What little representation they do have in the segregated charitable sector generally comes from small, splintered and significantly under-resourced projects who are often too busy firefighting to keep their frontline services afloat, that they have little or no time or resources to commit to sophisticated and coordinated lobbying of campaigns. I can also say from personal experience that advocates who do attempt to speak for male victims must constantly navigate concerns around language, tone, and the all too frequent perception or suggestion that anyone attempting to promote regard for men is somehow anti-women. This especially makes it difficult for men to act as advocates for male victims because they can be more easily smeared with accusations of misogyny, and sadly we have documented quite extraordinary examples of male advocates being targeted with baseless accusations and insidious, even illegal smear campaigns. We believe that proactive, positive action propelled by a strategy will help to address these issues, and by doing so to open up pathways to the same range of services and victim support that are made available to women and girls.
I thank the Noble Lady for that answer, but does she agree with Dame Vera Baird, the government's Victims Commissioner? And I quote, "It is estimated that 1 in 6 men will experience sexual violence or abuse in their lives. The Home Office's refreshed Supporting Male Victims document, which is notably not a strategy, will do shamefully little to advance these male victims' interests. It's hard to escape the impression that male survivors are an afterthought." Does the Minister agree with that statement?
My Lords, just following on from that question, 1/3 of domestic abuse victims are men, and per the new Domestic Abuse Act, boys who witness domestic abuse are also victims. Yet many male victims of violence are categorised as victims of, quote, violence against women and girls, while others have no specific policy. Does the Minister agree that this categorisation is semantic nonsense and that ignoring men's specific needs makes a mockery of equality? Moreover, will the government publish a parallel violence against men and boys strategy to cover all forms of intimate violence against men and boys?
So, why did we launch the campaign in Northern Ireland instead of, say, Wales, where Split the Difference began, or England, where we already work to protect the human rights of male victims through the courts? Why Northern Ireland when there is a significant momentum building in other regions towards securing parallel strategies for victims of both sex? The SNP have already committed to develop a male strategy in Scotland, and recently their Equalities Minister announced that a review of domestic abuse services for men and boys is underway. Meanwhile, in England and Wales, the Victim Commissioner has severely criticised the Home Office for their inaction, and when members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Men and Boys raised this issue with the Minister for Home Affairs last year, incredibly she conceded that from her perspective the main obstacle to developing one is currently a concern that women, female victims and the organisations that represent them might somehow disapprove.
Well, the Noble Lord is absolutely right with his figures, and I think had we done it in the way that he suggested, there may have been a lot of complaints from women and domestic abuse organisations that actually we hadn't reflected the fact that it was predominantly women who suffered from domestic abuse.
So again, if there is so much momentum currently building in other regions, why start the campaign in Northern Ireland? Well, to begin with, we believe that other regions of the UK have a lot to learn from the comparatively gender-inclusive approach that the Northern Ireland Executive have taken for quite some time. In stark contrast to strategies in other UK regions, the Northern Ireland strategy to stop domestic and sexual violence has for many years been portrayed as gender-neutral, and consequently from the title onwards promotes language, practices and actions that acknowledge the reality that everyone and anyone can be a victim of abuse.
It's important from a justice perspective, Mark, that we make our legislation, if you like, gender neutral, because we want to recognise that there are men, there are people who are transgender, there are those who are in same-sex relationships and so on, who are also subject to domestic violence and abuse. So the support that we offer and the legislation has to be gender neutral, but we also have to recognise
Minister,
that
I'm sorry to cut across you, but there are those who believe it is a mistake to make the language gender neutral. It dilutes the impact it will have and the benefit that it will bring to women and girls. You must be aware of that. Are you saying you're not taking that on board? You disagree, and that's not happening?
Well, because the law has to be blind to gender, but the approach that we take in terms of making change in society absolutely shouldn't be. So I've acknowledged at every stage that these are gendered crimes, that 70% of victims are women, but that also means that 30% of victims are not, and we can't ignore those 30% of victims.
And if you are wondering why the Northern Ireland Executive have adopted this significantly less discriminatory approach, the answer appears to involve the Northern Ireland Act 1998. Most particularly Section 75 of this Act, which introduces public sector equality duties into Northern Ireland well over a decade before they came into effect in the rest of the UK. More broadly, human rights and equality were central to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and it strikes me that the conscious and structural strides that public authorities have taken to promote equality between Northern Ireland's two main communities has also had a significant impact on their approach to equality across humanity's most ancient fault lines arising from perceived and actual differences between women and men. A second reason we decided to launch in Northern Ireland is that our stakeholders were telling us that the Northern Ireland Executive are in danger of potentially taking a step backwards in terms of their commitment towards equality for all. Northern Ireland's policy approach in this area is very much in a state of flux. And so from a practical perspective, this provided us with an opportunity to try to influence and help sustain the sort of change in one region that we ultimately wanted to see extended to all. As most of you listening will be aware, somewhat confusingly, the Executive are currently developing not one but two relevant strategies. Specifically, a revised strategy to stop domestic and sexual abuse for all victims, as well as a brand new strategy to tackle violence against women and girls. And our engagement has shown us that there remains a significant amount of confusion and difference of opinion about what each strategy will or actually should involve. The former, we are told, will be gender neutral, while the latter will adopt a more gender-sensitive approach, which means a policy or programme that takes into account the particularities pertaining to the lives of women and men, while aiming to eliminate inequalities and promote gender equality, including an equal distribution of resources. The purportedly gender-neutral strategy to stop domestic and sexual abuse is currently out for public consultation, and will be asking that the departments responsible for it commit to taking clear and robust action to address the issues I am about to highlight. Our formal campaign launch was in February 2022, when we shared a briefing paper outlining the argument for a male strategy to every single member of the NI Legislative Assembly, as well as to the key government ministers and departments with the power to make this a possibility. I think it's only fair to say that public authorities, ministers and MLAs weren't exactly clambering over themselves to engage with us immediately after the campaign launch, but in fairness with them, we fully acknowledged that February was also the month that the NI Assembly effectively collapsed and that MLAs were already beginning to focus on a May election. and I would suggest that there are very few votes to be had from publicly advocating for male victims of so-called gendered violence. Nevertheless, over the year, we went on to secure meetings with representatives from the Executive Office, the Department of Justice, the Department of Health, the Housing Executive, the Northern Ireland Mental Health Champion, the Victims Commissioner, the Children's Commissioner, the Equality Commissioner for Northern Ireland, and the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. We also progressed meaningful written engagement with others, including the Department for Communities, the PSNI and the Prison Service. All of this activity then culminated in a conference in Parliament buildings in November that represented a major milestone for the campaign. Delivered in partnership with Men's Alliance Northern Ireland, together we brought the conversation directly to the seat of power and control for public policy in Northern Ireland and helped to highlight the level of concern that exists for male victims in Northern Ireland.
A few facts and figures. There's not a single specialist bed for a man in crisis in Northern Ireland, no refuge for men, no 24-hour wraparound care. 1 in 3 victims of abuse are male, and this is expected to increase with the new coercive control laws due to the type of abuses that men face. 1 in 6 men will face abuse in their lifetime. 5 of 9 domestic homicides in 2021 to 22 were male. Undoubtedly, there is a link between high suicide rates of men, alienation from the children, and domestic abuse, and we would call for more research into this area. We need to include the men in conversation around domestic abuse. Let them understand that they are seen and that it happens to other men too. Men are not the problem. Abusive men are part of the problem, and abusive women are the other part of the problem. People abuse people. And these are important distinctions to male victims we support and should be clear in all discussions around domestic abuse. These men do not want to be seen as second-class victims. They want what they deserve and what they're entitled to from all services, which is to be believed and be supported as they travel towards being survivors. Thank you.
Most of the public authorities previously mentioned sent representatives to this conference, as did the Prison Service, a number of regional local government councils, police, community partnerships and health and social care trusts. Feedback about the day was almost exclusively being positive, with the 3 most popular words used by attendees to describe the event being informative, thought-provoking and powerful. Aspects of the day that attendees particularly appreciated were the opportunity to hear personal accounts directly from male victims and their families, and presentations from our expert speakers who addressed some of the science behind why male victims don't come forward and why public authorities sometimes struggle to see them when they do.
Firstly, when people say to me, "Oh, why don't men engage?" And I'm like, "Well, what are you offering them? What sort of service are you actually offering for someone to talk to you, for someone to engage with you, for someone to trust you, for someone to open up and share the most excruciating, painful experiences of their life? What are you offering them to start with?" And I kind of feel like if we're not going to offer what they need, a complex system that reflects the complexity on the inside that trauma leaves you with, then we're setting them up to fail.
In 2009, the Human Rights Professional Standards Committee of the Northern Ireland Policing Board conducted a thematic review into the PSNI's compliance with human rights law when tackling domestic abuse. It concluded that the police response to heterosexual male victims was a contentious issue because the majority of victims that they come into contact with are heterosexual females. The review also noted that there are few resources available to male victims who do not have access to the same range of services such as refuges and victim support. The following year, the Department of Health commissioned the Men's Advisory Project to conduct an exploratory study into the experiences and needs of male victims. This study found that support agencies were not trained on how to identify and support male victims, and that public narratives often only contained lip service due to the lack of specific support and resources available. A little over 10 years on from these reports, Split the Difference conducted a mapping exercise of support services available to male victims in Northern Ireland in 2022. We are pleased to report that this analysis did identify some significant positive developments in relation to the scope and quality of regard for male victims, as evidenced by examples of equitable service provision standards and inclusive public messaging. For example, the PSNI and Department of Justice funded public information media promoting awareness of coercive control and included diverse portrayals of both victims and perpetrators.
She takes control of our money, cash, credit cards, everything. She's getting us into debt.
Just you earn it, and I'll look after spending it, okay?
If I suggest that maybe she could work as well, she just puts me down.
Some man you are. Can't even support his family properly.
And when I try to talk about it, she starts yelling at me, and even the kids.
I'm scared, Daddy.
She intimidates all of us.
Coercive, controlling behaviour is still abuse, and it's a crime.
Furthermore, the Domestic and Sexual Abuse 24-hour helpline service, co-funded by the Department of Justice, Health and Communities, provides an equal service to all callers and even offers them the option to speak to a male or female operator. Nexus NI, who deliver the service, have clearly taken positive action to ensure that inclusive language and imagery is used to promote it, and the number of male callers to the helpline has risen significantly since they began delivering the service in 2018. We very much commend the relevant government departments for providing this vital service in partnership with Nexus and consider it to be a gold standard example of a state party providing a service to the general public in a manner consistent and compliant with national and international human rights law. Over a year of engagement with public authorities in Northern Ireland, we have also witnessed a clear and sincere desire among public services to work to ensure that the strategies, policies and services that they are responsible for protect the human rights of all victims of abuse. However, many of the specific concerns and issues that we have raised remain unresolved, and our briefing paper documents evidence of gaps in services, gaps in protections, gaps in knowledge, discriminatory practices, lip service, and the promotion of unhelpful myths and stereotypes. For example, Northern Ireland continues to be the only region of the UK without any specialist sanctuary accommodation made available to male victims and their children, and our research has found significant evidence to indicate that aspects of the Executive's current approach to tackling abuse and supporting victims is gender neutral in name only. Women's Aid and the Men's Advisory Project are regularly identified as key partners by the Executive in the provision of support to female and male victims respectively. Both rely heavily on statutory funding to deliver their services. In order to establish some sense of the scale and cause of existing and persisting gaps in services, we undertook a comparative analysis of the fiscal and staffing resources available between the two leading sex-specific service providers that the Executive rely heavily on to address gaps arising from an absence of statutory service provision. According to the Charity Commission in the most recent year, the Men's Advisory Project report an income of £216,000. They have 3 staff members, 17 volunteers, and provide counselling and signposting services to men experiencing domestic abuse across Northern Ireland. They also provide anger management support to both men and women. By comparison, Women's Aid comprise of a federation of 9 regional charities reporting a combined income of £10.5 million, 291 paid employees and 51 volunteers. They are able to offer a significant wider range of free support services to women and children, including emergency accommodation, floating support, rights support, legal and court advocacy, childcare, education and personal development programs, and support services for children and young people. Women's Aid Federation estimate that their members provide support to 8,000 women in the last year, and despite such comparatively limited resources, the Men's Advisory Project estimate an approximately 1,000 men received some form of support from them in 2022. Equality is definitely not a pie, but as you can see, our simple not equality statistics pie chart does provide us with a reasonably clear comparison of resources invested into strictly sex-segregated service infrastructure for male and female victims. It is, of course, important to stress that the majority of services available to victims of abuse in Northern Ireland should offer equitable services to all, regardless of their sex. Some NGOs specialise in helping children, older people, and members of the LGBT communities, and a range of crucial support services are provided directly by public authorities. Relatively uniquely in the charitable sector at present, the domestic abuse charity La Dolce Vita Project offers their services to anyone affected by domestic abuse, regardless of their sex or any other protective characteristic.
The Dolce Vita Project started back in my very own bedroom in 2015. I went through domestic abuse myself, and I went through many services. Multi-agency services was involved, criminal court, family court. I went through a 10-year journey being involved with multiple services as a victim of domestic abuse. But one thing that stood out for me was my support network and how some of those people could not attend meetings with me because they were male. I couldn't understand when I had support to why they were being dismissed. Through my own journey, I've seen a separation. I've seen a difference in how people was being treated. And for me, that wasn't fair. So putting my thoughts together, I decided to create the Dolce Vita Project. Back in 2016, we were the first registered domestic abuse and parental alienation charity that was working from a non-gender specific focus, and I'm very proud of that.
There are also 2 other male-specific charities currently offering services to victims of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland. These are the Men's Action Network, who deliver health and wellbeing services, and the Men's Alliance NI, who offer online peer support and advice from survivors, counsellors and support professionals. But as our amended not equality statistical pie chart shows, even when the annual fiscal and staffing resources of these 2 charities are added to our analysis, there remains a remarkably large and starkly obvious difference in the resources available within the sex-segregated domestic violence service sector. To put the scale of this difference into context, we would highlight that the annual salary of the CEO of the North Down and Ards Women's Aid is equivalent to the Men's Advisory Project entire staffing costs per year. Beyond the significant disparity of services made available to female and male victims, this funding gap clearly has wider implications for male victims, as the NGOs that speak for them will have comparatively very few resources or time to commit to lobbying government and raising wider public awareness about their needs. By comparison, the Northern Ireland Women's Aid Federation are members of a relatively large, vibrant and well-resourced women's sector who proactively and almost exclusively lobby on behalf of female victims. Given their size and sphere of influence, the women's sector in Northern Ireland and beyond has become highly influential in shaping perceptions about attitudes towards and political positions on women, men, boys, girls and gendered violence. Our assessment is that most women in the sector do generally acknowledge and support the need for more to be done to support male victims, but perhaps understandably, their focus and priority is on the rights and needs of women and girls. I should also say that over the timeline of our campaign to date, we have been unable to secure a meeting with the Men's Advisory Project. They also asked us to clarify that they have no association with the Split the Difference or our call on the Northern Ireland Executive to develop a strategy to tackle intimate violence against boys and men. We respect this request and acknowledge the important work that they do in a challenging environment with a relatively limited fiscal and staffing resources. One significant barrier to establishing equitable services for all victims is that the main public funding scheme that pays for them is presently effectively ring-fenced exclusively for women-only services. The Supporting People programme underpins vital supported housing service for around 20,000 vulnerable people in Northern Ireland every year at the cost of £73 million. The Northern Ireland Housing Executive, who administer this fund on behalf of the Department of Communities, estimate that 38% is spent on services for those at risk of homelessness, including victims of domestic abuse. Many different groups of vulnerable people benefit from support from this programme, and yet domestic abuse is the only strand where access to services is distinctly restricted to service users solely on the basis of their sex. The Department of Communities have advised us that male victims, and I quote, have not been identified as an area of priority need, and that in the absence of support, the NI Housing Executive work with them to identify temporary accommodation, which largely means allocations in homeless hostels, either run directly by them or by a third party. Now, with the greatest respect to those service providers, specialist domestic violence services provide a distinctly different type and standard of service to homeless hostels. Otherwise, there would be no need for them to exist. Refuge workers are trained to address the trauma and assist in the recovery process for people fleeing inter-partner and inter-family abuse. They provide access to counselling, legal advice, court representation, childcare, and other services that can be crucial to a victim's recovery. Crucially, these services are also offered on a floating support basis to help victims maintain independence by remaining in their home or at a safe place in the community. Split the Difference estimate that for every woman in Northern Ireland supported in refuge accommodation, 10 more are provided floating support.
Not every abused woman needs to go to a refuge. Women's aid centres across Northern Ireland offer support and advice on dealing with and preventing domestic violence.
Lots of people don't need refuge, they've got family support or they might have other resources available, but they still need and want to talk to somebody else. They also really want and need to meet others that are experiencing what they've experienced.
And while you're out there in the community, you can come back and do programmes with us such as Journey to Freedom, Protective Behaviours, all the women's aid programmes that are very well known. Your children will also have their needs met. They will do their group work, Helping Hands, Transformers, all the different groups, and we can also work with your children one-to-one or with the woman one-to-one. We will provide a creche for your children. While you do that, we will provide premises for you to meet with any agency you need to meet with and support you through all of that. You know, Women's Aid really is a wraparound service of a family. If the need within that family is not met by Women's Aid, we will seek an agency that does support that woman or meet her need.
Women's Aid also provides support for women to seek legal protection so they can remain in their own homes.
When women do need to access the courts, whether it be for various reasons, it could be non-molestation orders, occupation orders, there could be disputes over child contact, there could be civil bills like the division of assets, and also then in relation to criminal cases whereby the perpetrator of the violence is then held accountable through the courts and the woman is called as a witness. So having that support of a floating support worker to reassure her that everything is going to be fine and that she's doing well is an absolutely vital service.
The Supporting People programme is by far the largest funder of services delivered by Women's Aid in Northern Ireland. Based on an exception for charities allowed under equality law, they are entitled to restrict their services to women only. It has been long understood that domestic abuse and interfamily disputes are a major cause of homelessness for both women and men, and in Northern Ireland 85% of rough sleepers are estimated to be male. The Housing Executive's current Supporting People strategic plan identifies domestic violence as an area of increasing future need. According to the statistical analysis that informs it, roughly twice as many single men present as an at risk of homelessness than single women, and they also present in similar numbers to families at risk. The Department of Communities have advised us that the Housing Executive's strategic plan includes an action aligned to domestic violence to deliver new services and enhance delivery for people at risk of domestic violence. They advised us that new services will require additional funding and are subject to budget confirmation by one indication that vital services may finally be extended to male victims is that in 2022 the Men's Advisory Project secured limited in-year funding from the Housing Executive to pilot a project to provide floating support and outreach services to men at risk of homelessness due to domestic abuse. In addition, the Cithra Foundation, who provides emergency accommodation to female victims of domestic abuse with funding support from the Supporting People programme, has been in discussion with the Department's Social Development and Justice for a number of years over their plans to provide sanctuary accommodation for men and their children seeking to escape abusive relationships. Exclusively or predominantly, gendered policies and practices can create significant adverse impacts and diminished visibility for victims whose experiences do not fit within binary narratives about gendered or gender-based violence. Gendered policies and practices are also illegal under human rights and equality law unless they can be objectively justified and show to be a proportionate means of meeting a legitimate aim. Over a year of engagement with public authorities in Northern Ireland, we have identified and raised a range of concerns about potentially discriminatory practices arising from the Northern Ireland Executive's current approach to tackling domestic and sexual abuse. In terms of red flags, or if you will red lights, indicating barriers to pathways to protection for male victims, we have identified intersecting issues across at least 10 different areas of public policy. These include child protection, housing, provision of services, employment, statutory funding and procurement, partnership working, information and signposting, legislative reform, public policy development and design, and compliance with public sector equality duties. We have already raised most of these red flags with the relevant authorities, and in the final part of this presentation, I will now discuss them in the context of recommendations for positive action that we believe will best assist public authorities to comply with their statutory duties under equality and human rights law. We recommend that when seeking to drive positive change and open up pathways to protection for all, the relevant public bodies should adopt a gender-sensitive strategic approach. Over recent years, the Northern Ireland Executive have clearly shifted gears towards publicly adopting more gender-specific and gender-sensitive strategic approaches to addressing the needs of female victims. This can be evidenced by the development of a specific strategy to end violence against women and girls. By comparison, our assessment is that the Executive are still very much stuck in gender neutral when it comes to addressing the needs of men and boys. Adverse impacts arising from this two-tier approach will be further compounded by evidence indicating that aspects of the multi-agency strategy to tackle domestic and sexual abuse are gender neutral in name only, and in reality, at least some outputs are better suited to or even biased toward female service users. The existence of these significant and stark obvious gaps in public services has been well understood for at least a decade. They are effectively a direct outcome of the gender budgeting approach adopted by the relevant departments and public authorities responsible for the delivery of previous domestic abuse strategies. This approach has led to a disparity between funding for male and female specific services of at minimum £10 million per year. The Equality Impact Assessment of the new draft strategy does not acknowledge this and fails to identify any adverse impacts on men or women arising from the proposed approach. State party signatories to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are committed to recognise that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. These rights are enshrined in UK law by the Human Rights Act 1998, and all citizens are entitled to these rights without discrimination. Gender-specific and/or gender-sensitive actions are permitted under human rights equality law, provided they are reasonable, proportionate, balanced, and do not create detriments to other protected groups. The Northern Ireland Human Rights and Equality Commissions have both recommended that the Executive reconsider their gender-neutral approach and also advise that the strategy should include specialised, gender-sensitive, accessible support and actions for all victims. We believe that the best way to achieve this is by the development of two interconnecting strategies or action plans that aim to tackle intimate violence against women and girls and boys and men respectively. We believe that this approach will best enable the Executive and departments to objectively justify gender-sensitive actions progress to address the unique challenges victims can experience that are, through no fault of their own, related to their sex. Establish clear and accountable lines of collective responsibility. A consistent frustration that we encountered during our engagement with government departments involved establishing responsibility for the issues raised. Lines of vicarious responsibility become even less transparent when arm's-length bodies and third-party service providers are also involved. When we approached the Department of Communities in the Northern Ireland Housing Executive with concerns that sanctuary support services funded by them turn children away solely on the basis of their sex, it took 6 months before either were in a position to indicate that, as far as they are aware, this practice does not occur. Even then, this came with a caveat that access criteria for such services fall outside of their remit. Split the Difference have asked Northern Ireland Women's Aid Federation to confirm that children are not turned away from any of their refuges. To date, we have received no response to our request. We recommend that the Northern Ireland Executive should address credibility issues with Section 75 compliance. The capitulation of responsibility and remit for access criteria for public services can also be seen to circumvent responsibility to address adverse impacts arising from discriminatory and sex segregation practices. For example, despite obvious gaps in services provided to male victims by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, an equality impact assessment of their homeless strategy found that there were no adverse impacts for men or women arising from their approach. The assessment is based on the following logic. The strategy specifically addresses homelessness where it is directly associated with gender. Each case will be assessed individually, however we will draw on a range of services that may be able to offer advice or support associated with gender. Examples include, but are not limited to, Women's Aid, Men's Advisory Project and the Rainbow Project. We believe that such a perspective is extremely problematic in terms of both the spirit and letter of human rights and equality law, as the Housing Executive should understand that their policy of drawing on services associated with gender currently creates a highly significant adverse impact for their individual male service users. Furthermore, if providers in an open housing service market are genuinely unable to address obvious gaps in services for male victims, we believe that the housing executive should take steps to address this adverse impact by developing and delivering such services in-house, as they do in the case of some homeless hostels. The Executive Office have still not published any equality screening or equality impact assessment outcomes. After the Executive committed to a violence against women and girls strategy, violence against women and girls strategies in other regions have been shown to contribute to a marginalisation and invisibilisation of male victims, and there remains considerable confusion about how the Executive's proposed gender-specific and gender-neutral strategies will align. We applaud and support positive actions to prevent violence against women and girls. The absence of aligned positive actions for male victims may create significant detriments and chill factors for them. A credible equality impact assessment should identify any adverse impacts and assist the relevant departments to mitigate against them. Mitigate against adverse impact related to sex segregation service provision. Public authorities can be seen to be extremely reliant on services delivered by strategic partners who openly discriminate against service users solely on the grounds of their sex. We are concerned that sufficient steps have not been taken to address the adverse impacts arising from this reality. We are also concerned that some discriminatory practices may have become embedded and normalised in areas of public service provision. 9 of the largest domestic abuse service providers in Northern Ireland are exclusively female-led. 80% of health and social care sector and 75% of NGO sector employees are female. We also note that the majority of senior public servants and arm's-length commissioners that we have engaged with are also female, as were all members of the Department Community's Gender Equality Expert Advisory Panel. Women can be powerful allies and advocates to victims of abuse. Nevertheless, we encourage public authorities to guard against conscious, unconscious and gamma bias given to the significant underrepresentation of men in positions of power, control and responsibility in this area of public policy. Provide a greater focus on the importance of training on the needs and experiences of male victims in order to combat the sort of persistent myths, stereotypes and victim blaming we encountered and documented in our report. Also ensure accurate knowledge and awareness of the law and good practice among policymakers, employers and service providers. The Executive Office appear to understand that the proposed two-strand approach will be perceived by some as a political signal to public authorities, service providers, victims and the general public alike that male victims of crime are less important. We ask all politicians, public authorities and domestic abuse providers to consciously commit to equitable best practice standards of working and to promote clear and unambiguous messaging that they are committed to protecting the human rights of all victims. In partnership with Men's Alliance Northern Ireland, Split the Difference have developed the Be Seen, Heard and Safe Promise to assist them to promote inclusive messaging and a commitment to undertake a number of simple best practice steps to promote equality and combat discrimination. We thank and commend Naomi Long, MLA and leader of the Alliance Party, for being the first to commit her party to this promise. We also thank and commend her for her proactive work and commitment to the needs of all abuse victims and for her leadership in this complex, emotive, political and occasionally contentious area of public policy.
We at Alliance promise to help make everyone safe from abuse. We promise to ensure that anyone at risk of or experiencing abuse will be seen and heard by us. Domestic and sexual abuse are serious crimes and can happen to anyone, irrespective of age, race, disability, ethnicity, religion, gender identity or sexual orientation. It's important that people report those abuses, and it's important that we respond.
We encourage all political parties, politicians, public authorities, domestic abuse service providers and trade unions to follow her example and make the Be Seen, Heard and Safe promise. We ask that the relevant departments and the 5 regional health and social care trusts ensure all domestic and sexual violence partnership working arrangements are fit for purpose and that all healthcare professionals adopt an informed and equitable approach to addressing the needs of male victims. In our report, we highlight examples concerning practices relevant to 3 of the 5 regional partnership jurisdictions. For example, the Department of Communities have invested over 0.5 million of public monies into the construction and running costs of the recently opened Foyle Family Justice Centre. The purpose of the centre is described as a wraparound support service to victims of domestic violence. The Foyle Family Justice Centre is managed by Foyle Women's Aid, who self-identify as a women-only organisation. Split the Difference have contacted them to confirm the centre's services will be provided on an equitable basis with no access restrictions for men. To date, we have received no response to our correspondence. We encourage public authorities to work and support male victims, their families and advocates to raise awareness of their needs and contribute to relevant public policy, conversation and consultations. A major outcome of Split the Difference's engagement in Northern Ireland has been the co-founding of the Northern Ireland Men's Federation in partnership with Men's Alliance. The purpose of this federation will be to connect, support and represent organisations, professionals and academics committed to working collectively and collaboratively to bring about positive change for men and their families. We would encourage the Departments of Justice and Health to meet with the Federation members to discuss their draft strategy. And finally, we are concerned about the apparent lack of proactive regard or advocacy for male victims communicated by and to gatekeepers in civil society and watchdogs such as the Equality and Human Rights Commissions. To some extent, this appears to be informed by a lack of awareness and understanding of the needs of male victims arising from the relative absence of advocacy for them. Incredibly, the Northern Ireland Commission has advised us that no one has ever previously raised any of the numerous issues that we have now brought to their attention. We are especially concerned by perspectives provided to us by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, including the view that actions taken by the Executive to address abuse experienced by women and girls have no relevancy in the context of considering action or inaction by them to address abuse experienced by boys and men. Such a perspective appears to be relatively unique in the discipline of equality and human rights considerations, not least given that it is widely understood that Northern Ireland equality law generally and the Article 14 of the Human Rights Act specifically are informed by the concept of comparison of treatment and, indeed, a comparator is required to evidence breaches of these laws. The Commission has also not responded to our request that they seek urgent clarification from the UK Government on their assessment of the Istanbul Convention's compatibility with the Human Rights Act 1998. In 2022, the UK Government ratified the Istanbul Convention, which has significantly informed the Home Office's highly gendered violence against women and girls strategy. State parties are legally required to report to the European Commission on actions taken to protect and support female victims of violence only. The Convention gives an important political signal with regard to the status of victims, and at least to some extent ratification establishes a hierarchy of victims in UK law. Boys and men do not fall within the scope of protection afforded by the Convention. State parties are encouraged to apply its provisions to all victims of domestic violence, including men, children and the elderly. However, Parliament do not do so when ratifying the treaty into UK law. Following on from this, I will end this presentation by addressing our last recommendation directly to male victims, survivors, their families and advocates, and say that you can help to protect human rights by asserting them. The Northern Ireland Equality Commission have advised us that male victims, survivors, their families and advocates can seek to address the various issues highlighted in this briefing by progressing complaints through the individual equality schemes of each relevant public authority. We encourage male victim survivors, their families and advocates to consider the merits of such an approach, and we have included a case study in our report highlighting how Section 75 complaints can genuinely and sometimes relatively quickly help to effect positive change. I should also point out that the complaint featured in this case study led to positive outcomes for female victims also. We do not believe that pathways to protection for male victims compete with pathways for female victims. We believe that ethical protection pathways enhance and strengthen protections for all. When I met with the Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission recently, she encouraged anyone experiencing adverse impacts from gender policy to contact them. She also expressed her particular concern about the potential of adverse impacts on children who can both be witness and experience abuse. Split the Difference share this concern. In England and Wales, recent inquests into the brutal and tragic murders of 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes and little baby Star Hobson have once again highlighted the extreme dangers of stereotyping perceptions and practices around the perpetration of violence in the home. When it comes to addressing roadblocks for individuals seeking human rights protection pathways from UN state parties, it is crucial that we move past fixed binary perspectives about victims and perpetrators of abuse. When we seek to justify disadvantage and discrimination adversely impacting on male victims, we seek to justify disadvantage and discrimination impacting on men and boys across the full spectrum of Section 75 protective characteristics. I would encourage any man or boy experiencing abuse to also contact the Men's Alliance Northern Ireland, who offer online peer support and advice from survivors, counsellors and support professionals. I would also like to sincerely thank everyone who has engaged with Split the Difference over the past 12 months. I especially wish to thank all of the hard-working public servants who have taken the time to meet with us and watch this presentation. Thank you for your commitment to understanding and addressing the needs of victims of abuse, and for your leadership in this complex, emotive, and occasionally contentious area of political public policy. There remains an urgent need to open up pathways to protection for male victims, and we would encourage public bodies in other UK regions, as well as all UN state parties, to consider the many positive examples of best practice to be found in the Northern Ireland approach to date, such as the following excellent public message animation that I will close with.
Domestic abuse is often a hidden crime happening behind closed doors. Unfortunately, it is so embedded in the daily lives of some that victims and perpetrators may not realise such behaviour is abusive.
Domestic abuse does not discriminate. Anyone can be a victim or perpetrator, people of any gender, any sexuality, and from all walks of life.
Until victims are aware that there is a safe environment to share their concerns, they will continue to hold on to the secret of domestic abuse.
Domestic abuse takes many forms and is about power and control.
Verbal abuse,
Controlling you, financial abuse,
sexual abuse, and physical abuse.
We recognise that victims may have concerns that prevent them from speaking out or seeking help. You have the right to feel safe. Help is out there. You are not on your own. Tell someone.
Domestic abuse is a crime, and police are here to listen and to work with our partners to protect you.
You will be treated with dignity and respect. If you report a crime, the police will act on this.